Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on the program tonight, we are, yes, in our All Things Congo edition, Africa edition, make me want to holler, all things Black people from Turtle Island to Britain and elsewhere. We are joined by another fantastic friend and ally to the people of Congo and much of Africa. He's a person who uses his journalism, activism, and books to educate the masses and hopefully mobilize the masses to stop the ongoing exploitation, scramble, and imperialism order in Africa. Our guest is our frequent champion, Yves Engler, Canadian historian, NGO critic, media critic, anti-imperialist thinker, and activist. He's a member of Disruption Canada, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and the host of his own show on YouTube, the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. He's the author of 12 or 13 books. His latest is Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, which he co-wrote with Owen Schluck, and I'm forgive me if I'm butchering his name, and of course the author of Canada and Africa: 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation. Yves, welcome back to the program, especially on Congo's Independence Day.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's a real honor to have you. You were supposed to have joined us a couple of hours ago with Ann Garrison, but it's okay. You had some fatherly duties and also, yeah, all good. So, Yves, the first question I wanted to ask you is, before we talk about current events that's going on in Congo and its evil neighbors, Rwanda under Paul Kagame and Uganda under Yoweri Museveni, give us, if you can, a brief history of Congo when it was given independence from the Belgians. And anyone who knows about Belgian history and African history knows that Belgium was one of the most brutal European countries to colonize an African country. But I don't want to talk too much about that. I'm more interested in what happened within months of Congo's independence with Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected and democratic socialist leader of Congo, when he was undermined by Belgium, the U.S., Canada, and France. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I think basically it was, of course, a very brutal colonial rule. Belgium worse than the British or French rule, generally viewed that way. And basically the Belgians, as the decolonization process picked up around the continent, they decided to try to do a quick decolonization to improve their position, which was essentially to offer political independence, but try to keep control of the vast resources of the nation, particularly in the east. And Patrice Lumumba was elected with a different view of what decolonization meant. So he wanted to actually have the resources of the country controlled by the people of the country. And in response, the Belgians supported a secessionist movement in the east, and Lumumba
was that known as, and was that known as the Congo Crisis? And that was the Katanga that the Belgians were, and this was basically like Belgium doing a divide and conquer thing. So the people of Katanga, the Katanga secessionists, they weren't. It wasn't like a grassroots homegrown thing. It was more like a colonial, neo-colonial thing that the Belgians and their allies were doing.
I don't know how much support in the region there was for a secessionist movement, but it was completely supported by Belgium in the sense that the royalties and the mineral resources, they had control over that, and that was, of course, very damaging for the government, the newly independent government, those resources were essential to have independence that kind of mattered, or that could work. And so the point was to basically, you have a government you don't like that's trying to get control of the resources that have been taken up by the Belgian and other multinationals, European, North American, and so you support a secessionist movement. This is not a particularly new tactic, as you mentioned, a divide and rule type of dynamic. And Lumumba, basically, he turned to the UN to help maintain the territorial integrity of the newly independent country, which everyone agreed that that was the territory of Congo, obviously with the exception of the secessionist movements, but even the Americans and the Belgians essentially agreed that that was all Congolese territory, Katanga, including the region of Katanga that the secessionist movement took hold in. But so the UN mission, which again Lumumba wanted it to kind of protect the territorial integrity, basically Washington saw the UN mission as a way to undermine Lumumba, and Canada led the military part of the mission, and they basically worked to undermine Lumumba in a whole bunch of ways. In one instance, there were Canadian troops that were beaten up by some Congolese troops, and the Canadian government made a huge kerfuffle about it, tried to make it a big incident, a way to sort of embarrass Lumumba. Canadian aid was channeled through the UN mission, while the UN mission was working to very clearly to undermine Lumumba. And then when the UN mission blocked supports from Moscow to come into the country, and so they basically undermined Lumumba that way when he turned towards Moscow after being undermined by the NATO bloc, and so then Lumumba gets basically deposed in a dubious constitutional maneuver. He's put under house arrest, and he escapes house arrest. And the Canadian military leader, he basically prods Mobutu, the head of the military, to tells him where Lumumba is, send aircraft. Canadians are part of the aircraft. They recapture Lumumba, and not that much longer, later, he's assassinated. So we have the internal documents from Diefenbaker government, and him and his foreign minister were very openly and aggressively anti-Lumumba. So they're positioning the head of the Canadian military in there boasts about the story I tell you about, just said about recapturing Lumumba. He boasts about it in like 96, I believe, in 1996, in an interview that he had sort of coordinated the plan to recapture Lumumba. Afterwards, Canadians, when Mobutu, of course, takes power, Canadians are very close to Mobutu in the early years. So I've often said this, that after the US and Belgium, Canada, I think, was the third biggest contributor to the demise of a socialist, Pan-Africanist, anti-colonial independence leader.
What's interesting, during that coup against Lumumba, wasn't JFK the leader of the United States at the time?
I believe he was, yeah.
which means and then during the 90s, well, of course we're going to talk about Congo in the 90s, and that was the reign of Bill Clinton when Mobutu was overthrown and Rwanda continues to harass and pillage Congo. All of that was under the Clinton administration of the 90s, right?
It's actually Eisenhower is still in office until 1961. So the Lumumba's assassinated early. Yeah, so it's actually mostly the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower, I believe, was a Republican. Yes, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, there goes me trying to stick it to the Democrats. Well, history saves them for that. But the Democrats are also bad when it comes to Congo and international politics. But so Congo was later under the autocratic control over of Mobutu Sese Seko, propped up by the U.S., Canada, France, Belgium, Britain, and so forth. And of course, if you were part of Mobutu's tribe and inner circle, you could live a very decent existence and have a good piece of the pie. Anyone else, and certainly if you were a leftist of any sort, found themselves jailed, some tortured, and killed. Millions of Congo's own money was effectively stolen and put into Swiss banks. Mobutu also helped the U.S. and its allies in the Angolan Civil War, in which the West was trying to crush a Marxist project/movement in that country and fighting against Soviet proxy forces and the Cuban army. What of Mobutu's legacy do you think still lives on in Congo? Do you think?
I don't know that I don't know enough about Mobutu's legacy to speak to that with any particular insight. I think it's pretty widely accepted that he was quite a brutal, obviously, in power for more than 3 decades. I know that there are people in the Congo, if you look at how things have progressed since Mobutu's demise, that in fact they almost kind of look back fondly. I think particularly in the east of the country, that they sort of look back fondly on those times. But yeah, I mean, he was somebody who was, very much his rise to power is intimately connected to the machinations of Washington, Brussels, Ottawa. There was, as my understanding, there was a period of sort of nationalism, some sort of Pan-Africanist kind of dimensions, changing of names and stuff like that. That was somewhat, kind of maybe somewhat positive. But I really don't know enough about to delve into sort of the ins and outs of Mobutu's regime and the kind of historical legacy to speak that with any degree of kind of confidence.
You're being too modest, Eve. That's exactly how I would actually describe Mobutu's legacy. Perfect segue to this question, which is what in the hell happened to Congo in the 90s? And classic Western imperialism, Mobutu, very much like the Shah, very much like Saddam Hussein, to a degree, Hosni Mubarak, and of course Marcos of the Philippines, he was hailed, propped up by the West, but later betrayed by the West. And he was overthrown in the coup led by Laurent Kabila, who was backed by Rwandan proxy forces led by Paul Kagame, who was and still is backed by the West. So talk to us about that period. And of course, we can't talk about that period without talking about Rwanda. So give us some important background information on Paul Kagame and so forth, and the UN's dirty role, if the UN had any dirty roles in all of this.
Yeah, so obviously in the Great Lakes region of Africa, there is one incident or one kind of big kind of historical area that people are familiar with, which is the Rwandan Genocide. Now, there's background to that that's always kind of eliminated from the popular discussion. First of all, maybe I'll just say with regards to Kagame. Kagame was somebody who had been he actually helped depose three different African leaders in Uganda in 86, in Rwanda 94.
Actually, sorry to interrupt. So Paul Kagame helped depose of Milton Obote when he returned to power after years of Western backing of Idi Amin. I know there was a conflict. There was a kind of a civil war that happened between Uganda, between Milton Obote and Western-backed bootlicker for imperialism Yoweri Museveni. So Kagame helped Museveni get into power, or?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he was Kagame grew up in Uganda.
Yeah.
He fled. His family was tied in with the Tutsi monarchy that fled to Uganda from 59 to 61. Tens of thousands, I think maybe into hundreds of thousands of Tutsi fled into Uganda. Well, just across the border where the Ankole, the Bahima, the Bahima are essentially in Ankole. They are Tutsi essentially. It's just a different word across the border, and so he grew up and he was part of the NRM, the National Resistance Movement that was led by Museveni, and they captured power in 1986, and the official story is that the invasion of Rwanda in 1990 by the RPF, that they kind of, but what happens is that 4,000 Tutsi, mostly Tutsi, almost entirely Tutsi, members of the Ugandan military invade Rwanda, and they had all kinds of high up positions. I'm forgetting his name right now. Who actually heads the RPF initially? He was the defense minister for a period of Museveni's early government, and they invade Rwanda, and yeah, so Kagame was part of the RPF. He of course was being trained at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the U.S. Officer training program for like elite training of elite officers around the world, and U.S. officers as well. And so yeah, so he's involved in the overthrow of three different African leaders. So they invade, the RPF invades Rwanda in 1990, basically with the backing of Uganda, a much bigger neighbor. It's a very violent war. They displace large numbers of Rwandans, principally Hutu, of course, and the country is very much destabilized. And there's a first elected government in Burundi, which has got a similar demographic makeup as Rwanda in terms of the Hutu Tutsi divide, which is in large part sort of like a caste divide. They all speak the same language, go to the same same religious kind of practices, cultural practices, principally. There's just a class divide historically based upon who were the cattle herders, the wealthy people, the cattle herders, and they also the Tutsi dominated military affairs, and it's kind of like a closeness to monarchy was really the distinction between Hutu and Tutsi, and so the Burundi, there's this coup. The Tutsi military overthrows the elected Hutu government. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands are killed. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands flee, principally Hutu flee into Rwanda, further destabilizing the country. This is in 1993. And so it's basically a tinderbox. The RPF controls a big chunk of the country. Then they blow up the airplane with the presidents of Habyarimana of Rwanda and much of the military high command and the Burundian president. And that basically unleashes horrors, huge horrors in Rwanda, which includes genocidal killing of Tutsis. Whether there is this sort of long planned out plot to kill all Tutsis in Rwanda, that's the evidence never really was ever put forward for that at the International Tribunal. Nevertheless, it's horrible violence. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands are killed. The Kagame uses this to come to power in Rwanda, and hundreds and hundreds of millions, I think, of Rwandans actually flee. They flee in different directions, heavily into Eastern Congo, but they also flee into Tanzania and elsewhere. And 2 years later, the Rwandans basically claim that there's a threat to them in Eastern Congo, and that Eastern Congo Tutsis are under threat, and they basically use that to back Kabila's forces, which go on a 1,500-kilometer march to Kinshasa and ultimately take power take control of the country. And then when Kabila turns on the Rwandans and expels the Rwandans, they will then reinvade not long after, and then that precipitates an 8-country war that is incredibly brutal, generally viewed as millions of people were killed. And Canadian companies are kind of in the background. There's the UN, there's this weird, very bizarre kind of like UN mission that Canada leads, that is a sort of very short-term mission that's basically the US and Canada avoiding the French getting control of this mission, and it has to do with the refugees in east of the Congo and how the Rwandans are using that question to justify their destabilization and invasion. So yeah, Canada supports this. It supports it in the sense that it plays some diplomatic games. There's also the whole framing of what happened in Rwanda. And in fact, I actually just listened to this interview from Kagame gave to France 24, maybe about a week ago. And Kagame was he's once again justifying. So now this report came out in the Globe Mail that there's 4,000 Rwandan troops in Eastern Congo. Actually, I think they're saying now more Rwandan troops than there are actually M23 fighters. So obviously they've been backing the M23 for 2 years, but this makes it it's even more of just a Rwandan invasion and war than just a sort of like backing a proxy force. And so now it's sort of like it's hard to Kagame to even deny that they're in Eastern Congo. And so now he's like justifying it all on the grounds that Tutsi in Congo are under threat, and that there's refugees that have fled into Rwanda. And so here you have it 30 years after the Rwandan genocide, which, if you really think about it, the individual that's most responsible for the mass killings is in fact Paul Kagame.
Exactly. And I
right?
believe there's enough documents reveal that shows that he was actually the one that shot down the airplane of
There's no doubt. It's not even. It shouldn't even really be up for discussion anymore. He blew up the plane. We know that he blew up with RPGs that were provided by the Ugandan military, and that's been on the front page of the Globe Mail. It always made sense that the RPF did it. That was the only group that really made sense to have done it. But so that was already, and the Globe Mail has shown they actually traced which rocket propelled grenades that were taken out of the Ugandan stock. I believe they came from Russia initially, and so they found like the serial numbers and stuff like that. The Globe Mail reported this maybe 3-4 years ago, and Jeffrey York, their correspondent in South Africa, is the one who's done a lot of good stuff on this, and so that's not. I don't think that question is up for debate. But even before their role in blowing up the plane, I mean, the act of aggression that took place in 1990, where Uganda and RPF invade Rwanda, the act of aggression, according to Nuremberg trial, it encompasses the entirety of the crimes. Now, I'm not saying I completely agree with that.
It's also amazing how that part of history just gets completely omitted and ignored when talking about Paul Kagame.
Yeah, of course. He's just a savior. Rather than the person who has the most responsibility for the genocidal killings of spring 1994, he is the savior according to the official discussion. But I mean, like I said, I think that, like, if you look at the question dispassionately, if you just don't go with the whole propaganda kind of narrative, and you just sort of look at the facts dispassionately, you'll find that is actually correct. That's not to say that there aren't other actors who have lots of blood on their hands, and it's also not to say that, honestly, when you think about it, the Tutsi that were exiled into Uganda, they I don't think they had the right to come back in to reassert a Tutsi dominated government, like which they've done.
Yes.
But they had as they were refugees, they were exiled. I mean, they were elite sectors. You could make some degree of a parallel with like the Cubans in Miami and their Bay of Pigs and invading Cuba to reassert their privilege. And there is a truth in that, but there is also it is a bit of a complicated question about people who were, refugee of a country and their rights and stuff like that. So it's not a totally clear-cut kind of dynamic, but yeah. So I think that's part of the background, and as every day passes, as we get further away from 1994 or any of the sort of like bit more murky questions where it's not all to blame, where Kagame is not all to blame. Now, I mean, 30 years later, and using the Rwandan genocide to justify displacing a couple million people in Eastern Congo, which Kagame was doing very clearly in this interview that he gave to France 24 that I listened to a week ago. That just gets that he has this ideological tool in his pocket that has been basically granted to him in large part by the Western powers, with Canada being right at the center of creating or of nurturing. Creating is maybe too strong a word, but of nurturing this ideological framing of the Rwandan genocide that Kagame is mobilizing 30 years later to once again unleash horrors in Eastern Congo, and Canada's role in that. Like, I mean, the most obvious contribution is everything to do with Romeo Dellaire, and I'm not going to get into all of that, but Romeo Dellaire has been right at the heart of creating that narrative. And Romeo Dellaire, former Canadian general who led up the military part the UN mission in Rwanda in 1993-94, Romeo Dellaire, is somebody who continues to be a close ally of Kagame, despite, the obvious dictatorship internally within Rwanda and the absolute mayhem that Kagame has unleashed in Eastern Congo. And quite frankly, like Romeo Dallaire has, he has this whole initiative about like child soldiers with operations that are in Kigali, part of his I think his African base for his child soldier initiatives in Kigali. But Rwanda is like found to be using child soldiers in Congo. So every level which you sort of look at this question and poke around on it, you find that it's just the level of like hypocrisy and double standards are just completely rife. But the big picture and all that is to say is that we have supported Kagame as not only he has imposed this very brutal dictatorship internally within Rwanda, but also as he's caused just incredible suffering in Congo, specifically in the east of the country.
Unbelievable. And and as you mentioned, Laurent Kabila, it's funny how all of these people who do the dirty deeds of imperialism always think that they're not going to be the ones to later be betrayed by the imperialists. So Laurent Kabila, he wants the Rwandans out of the country. He's later murdered and replaced by a more obedient bootlicker for Western imperialism, Joseph Kabila, who told us that apparently he was actually the adopted son of Joseph Kabila, and that his mother was actually a Rwandan, which I find quite interesting. How do you assess the legacy of Joseph Kabila? And my follow-up question to that is, what is the current state of the Congo when we talk about Felix? I'm blanking on his name. Felix Tshisekedi, I think that's his name. Yeah. So how do you assess Kabila's legacy followed by Felix
Again, I wouldn't say I'd like know enough about Kabila's legacy to speak with any confidence. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he was letting foreign mining interests pillage the country and not stopping, not doing what was necessary to block the Rwandans and Ugandans, principally Rwandans in Eastern Congo. And I know a lot of people, viewed him as a sort of sellout and kind of in the pocket of Kigali, or too sympathetic to Kigali. Yeah, so I don't know enough to just go to speak with confidence, but yeah, he certainly didn't seem like a progressive leader. And that goes with the current leader as well. But I don't like what I've never totally understood is the power imbalance. It's always been a little bit unclear to me why the Congolese military is not able to take on the Rwandan military.
In fact, that was another one of my follow-up questions, which is why do you think under this current leader, why do you think he hasn't been able to just evict Rwanda from his country? Many Congolese people want him to do that, and it's just
Well, I mean, I think that my speaking speculatively and not somebody who understands military affairs that well, and not somebody who follows Congolese politics closely enough to speak with any degree of confidence. But my sense is that the Rwandan military is a powerful military. It's a well-organized military, and that's because it's received a lot of support from the Western powers So I think that's part of it. But I think that how I've always understood the Congolese critique, certainly of Kabila, and also Tshisekedi,
Yeah.
is that he is that there's been a lack of will to fully, confront the Rwandans. They have had the backing of South African forces, for instance, and they do right now. There are South African forces fighting in the east of the country, basically on behalf of the central government. And the fact that they're not able to defeat the Rwandans does speak to the fact that the Rwandan army is I think a fairly effective fighting force.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't really sort of like know kind of well enough to be that confident on that kind of question.
Well, yeah, no, it is quite unbelievable, but I'm curious then, uh, sort of a follow-up question, I wanted to ask, is actually, no, I'm completely blanking out on my question. Sorry, folks. It is way too hot in this room. No, but sort of, no, but I would, but actually, no. Then how do you assess this one player in the Congo? Let me get his name. The good doctor Denis Musakendi. How do you assess his role in Congolese affairs and his efforts in trying to become president of Congo? And can you tell us anything actually about the movement behind him, or?
Yeah, I don't know enough to speak about the movement behind him. I mean, what I see him saying in kind of like what trickles into kind of, Western media and some kind of like international online media that I see is that he's blaming Rwanda for the invasion. So he's kind of pushing back against the sort of dominant, the narrative that we get, which tends to confuse things. I don't know if he's kind of come to fame in the Western circles because of his role in helping women that have been raped in Eastern Congo, and my understanding is that he politicizes that and saying this isn't just sort of like kind of falling from the sky, but the rape is coming from this policy of intervention by Rwanda and the like. So I think that's positive, but I don't know if it's based upon some sort of like grassroots movement that is well founded. My sense, seeming like in like online, some of there's been demonstrations here in Montreal from the Congolese community and some of that. My sense is that within the Congo, it's a very strong hostility towards Rwanda. It's not like a minority position at all. It's like an overwhelming majority are very critical of Kagame. They often call him the Hitler of Africa. It rarely trickles into our media, which is very pro Kagame. But that is a quite strongly held opinion within Congolese. I think both in terms of like sort of intellectual circles and just the common public. But yeah, I just one thing I would say just to kind of that I think is important, the area on the Congo that I've kind of delved into is that Canadians actually helped conquer, or Canadian helped conquer the Congo, or specifically the Katanga region, on behalf of King Leopold II, right? So William Stairs participated in the first ever European crossing through the center of the continent, through Congo, and then subsequently led a mission for King Leopold that conquered the Katanga region for Leopold. You know, William Stairs is still celebrated. There's a street named after him in Halifax. He was trained at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario, where they train proper white gentlemen to fight on behalf of British imperialism, but in this case, the Belgian king. And then there were actually quite a few Canadian missionaries that supported the Belgians and that were in Congo during this period. So and also that the King government, you know, in later decades was completely comfortable with Belgian rule, and you know they had trade missions and they you know so like there is this connection, Canadian connection to the history, which is a really horrible, brutal history of you know King Leopold's rule, but also Belgian rule. That's you know part of the background to you know just the sort of instability, the vulnerability, et cetera, that the country is you know in today.
Did Canada play a role in the kind of propping up of the Tutsi elites along with the Belgians, or was that a completely different history, in which both Belgium and Canada don't really have any role to play in that?
You mean within Rwanda in terms of propping up the Tutsi elite?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Canada across the continent, Canada basically supported European rule throughout the colonial period, right? There's basically no indication, though there's a sort of like idea out there that Canada opposed colonialism in Africa. There's just basically nothing in the public record of Canadian officials opposing, and there's lots of forms of support, right? So Canada provided the Belgians with all kinds of weaponry in the early 1950s through the NATO Mutual Assistance Program as they were suppressing independence movements in Congo, and while they were, you know, administering rule in Rwanda, and of course they reinforced the Tutsi elite in Rwanda, and I think they did sort of like racialize it a little bit. I think that's sometimes a little bit exaggerated, is my sense, but they did racialize it to an extent. And But I don't think that Canada, you know, kind of played. I think there were some Canadian missionaries in Rwanda. I think I should document a couple examples of that in the Canada and Africa book. Um, During Belgian rule, but it wasn't like a significant kind of contribution.
Fascinating. And you still shocked at how Rwanda gets away with what they do in Congo? Our previous guest and Garrison, she says that one of the ways that she tries to mobilize people to do solidarity work with Congo and to speak out against Rwanda is to just compare what Paul Kagame does to what Israel does in Palestine, especially when it comes to using past victimhood and grievances to justify, basically to justify the unthinkable, normalize the unthinkable, which is Israel's dispossession of Palestinians, and what Paul Kagame is doing, not just within, Rwandan borders, but outside of Congo, in which she actually even accused Kagame of even trying to build a greater Rwanda, like what Israel wants to do with some within Israel wants to do with like the whole greater Israel project. I'm curious your response to that, and the fact that that is just shocking that Paul Kagame gets away with all this, especially when the guy goes after the guy who's supposedly saved many people during the atrocities of Rwanda, the whole Hotel Rwanda, the hero of that one, he jailed him. So, yeah. your response?
Yeah, no, I think it is pretty remarkable. I think it really is. It's one of the more remarkable sort of Western narratives that justify really kind of stunning atrocities. And Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, has been uh, buddy buddy with Kagame, and they set up a just after the latest violence, but I guess it's about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, um, that they unleashed in Eastern Congo. They set up a full embassy in Kigali, and Trudeau went there as part of the Commonwealth meeting, and just deepen relations. And the Globe and Mail, Jeffrey York, the South African correspondent, has reported on this. He reported on about maybe a year and a half ago or something like that. He had I think it was on the front page. Um, he had this story about how there's big sectors of Global Affairs Canada, of the global foreign affairs bureaucracy in Canada, that are actually quite uncomfortable by how close Trudeau was to Kagame. And there's just there's just so much documented evidence of him being this brutal dictator who's caused all kinds of mayhem in Eastern Congo. He's been assassinating dissidents. Of course, that's what Jeffrey York's reported on a bunch from, in South Africa, going back many years, where, former allies among the Tutsi elite in his government, when they turn on him, he then goes and kills them, even when they're in South Africa, and sort of have, some degree of protection from the South African government. So all of that is like well documented. It's like kind of like the contrast between like what has actually appeared in these papers, right? They have been reported on in the Globe and Mail specifically, and then the kind of like the sort of aura around Kagame is really pretty remarkable. Like, yeah, he's basically been responsible for millions of people killed. He runs a brutal dictatorship internally. He assassinates his opponents all around Eastern Africa and South Africa, even in Belgium and Canada. He's threatened people and whatever. And yeah, but he's just sort of like glowing. He's still like a reformer kind of. It's fascinating to see that. Like again, I say, Romeo Dellaire, who was supposed to be a great humanitarian Canadian general, was in Kigali in the last like 10 months, I believe it was, meeting with Kagame. Oh, it was the 30th anniversary yeah, it was the 30th anniversary. Yeah, I think it might have been the 30th anniversary of Rwandan Genocide, or just before that. Yeah. So like that relationship just sort of continues, even though like anyone who like looks into it, like even all kinds of sort of staunchly pro Kagame kind of academics previously have now, like a whole bunch of them have like turned and now are appalled by what we've seen. So yeah, it is a fascinating one. There is deep backing from Washington, UK, also from Israel, right? Israel has allowed Kagame to like be part of the genocide club. There's an ideological connection there in terms of granting that kind of status that the sort of Holocaust museums and the like grant to what happened in Rwanda. And so yeah, it's pretty impressive, and of course it's the people in Eastern Congo who've been the major victim of all this.
Unbelievable. And yet, well, I'm pretty sure it's probably impossible to get close to Paul Kagame and Dallaire, but has anyone have activists who yeah, have activists, like confronted Dallaire for his complicity in propping up Paul Kagame and like called him out? Now, because Paul Kagame himself, he has been called out at times when he's given these speeches to overpriced universities and so forth, but they're met with pretty quick, brutal.
Yeah, I have I confronted Dallaire one time in a pretty in a somewhat passive kind of way. I was at this event at Concordia University, and there was going to be Erwin Kotler and no, I've actually, I think maybe twice. Did I one time I think I interrupted uh Romeo Dellaire event at Concordia, and then I actually challenged him, and he was walking out of the event, of an event another time, and I challenged him a little bit on Kagame. I've been looking to find Dellaire for a long time, and he has a new book out that came out, and it looked like he was about to do a bunch of public speaking with that, but then something, they say he had some sort of health issue, and so he seemed to have canceled the public events associated with that. But yeah, not really. No, I mean, no one in the public. The biggest propaganda in Canadian foreign policy that I'm familiar with is that the head of the UN mission in Rwanda in 1994, Jacques Roger Boubou, who is a former foreign minister of Cameroon, somebody who would be infinitely more knowledgeable about African affairs than Romeo Dallaire. He wrote a whole book called Le Patron de Dallaire Parle,
Yeah.
the boss of Dallaire Speaks, that basically details how Dallaire aided the RPF, and how basically, because Dallaire had blood on his hands for the mass killing that then develops. And that book, I did a search. I can't remember exactly right now. This is when I did the Canada and Africa book 10 years ago. It was like it was reviewed one time by a Canadian media outlet, and on the other hand, I did a search, and it was mentioned like one or two other times or something like that. And I did a search for Romeo Dallaire and Romeo Dallaire's book. And if I remember correctly, it was like 1,700 mentions of Romeo Dallaire's book in the Canadian newsstand search. And then when I did a broader Google search, it was like 6,000 or something like that. But the basic point being is that there's been tons and tons and tons of mentions of Romeo Dallaire in a sort of positive light, his book, all this kind of stuff about what happened in Rwanda. But when a former foreign minister of Cameroon published an entire book criticizing Dallaire, that just got completely ignored within the Canadian media. So it's it just reflects that sort of bias towards kind of a pro-Canada narrative, and obviously pro-Dallaire narrative, and pro-Canadian military narrative, et cetera, et cetera.
Makes me sick to my stomach, Eve, and people need to, people have got to protest more about that and decolonize a lot of their minds about that, because it's stunning how, I believe you even mentioned on the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour that a peace group was propping up Dallaire and so forth. And actually, almost done. Almost done with my questions. But I have to ask this question.
I do actually got to go pretty quick, because I got to put the little one to bed. It's already 9:32 here, so.
Oh, okay, sure, no problem. Okay, then two very quick questions, which is, I'm curious your response, your assessment of Yves Engler, feminist playwright who wrote the Vagina Monologues, activist who's done a lot of work in Congo. You're an NGO critic, so I'm curious, how do you assess her supposed good deeds in Congo?
I don't know enough about that to speak with any confidence.
Okay, no problem. And last question then. In the past few years, but also in the past several months, we've, with Israel's genocidal offensive in Gaza, or defensive if you support Israel, there has been protests, notably in Britain, the US, and Canada. I don't know about Belgium or Congo, but there have been protests against Rwanda's endless military and proxy aggression in Congo. In fact, actually, many Congolese players in football have even been protesting what Rwanda's been doing to Congo. Lukaku, Belgian player of Congolese background, has also been protesting on the football field what Rwanda's been doing in Congo. So that being said, there are those within Congo and those within Sudan who are trying to link their anti-imperialist movements with Palestine solidarity movements, and to connect the dots that the injustice that the Palestinians suffer from our Western capitalist governments, the same goes on when it comes to the injustices in Congo, Sudan, West Papua. Your reflection on this, and do you think we'll see in the coming months, or maybe even in the coming year or two, more urgent solidarity given to the people of Congo Zaire? And I refuse to say DRC because Congo's not a democratic republic. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's right. They're right to connect the struggles, and I think there is a you know the what's happened in there's no way that Kagame or Rwanda could do what it's doing in Eastern Congo without backing of the Anglosphere, and it's tied into the pillaging of resources and the sort of imperialist exploitation like that. So none of that's and what's happening to Palestinians is connected to that. Of course, Israel couldn't do what it's doing without the backing of Washington principally, but other countries like the UK and Canada as well. So that's important, and I think that the just a basic kind of moral lens of international solidarity is important in both cases. Do I think that the movement is going to on the Congo is going to grow? I mean, it could grow, but do I think it's going to be a significant movement in the short term? There's no way. I'm not seeing any indication that's likely. That doesn't mean it's not important to build, but whether that's what's necessary for that to happen is many things, but it's always organizing, it's reaching out, it's building the knowledge and stuff like that. And I think what you do see with the Palestine issue is that each mobilization over many decades now has sort of like planted seeds that the reason why there's the degree of mobilization we're seeing today, which is unprecedented in Canadian history. There's no international focused movement that's ever been this big and sustained. That's because of previous mobilizations in large parts, partly because of how horrible what Israel's doing, but also because of previous mobilization. So it means that every film screening on what's going on in the Congo, and each discussion, each article, it might not lead to anything in the short term, but it can plant seeds that later on lead to bigger mobilizations. So it's very important to do it. But I'm not seeing, unfortunately, any sort of like movement on the horizon that's going to really sort of build up and take the streets or whatnot. At this point, I think it's mostly within Congolese communities.
Well, here's hoping that that noble movement continues to grow and grow, and I wish them all the best of luck on that. And of course, that's where the great work of of people like you and Garrison, Phil Potts, and so forth do fantastic work on that, and Phil Taylor as well. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, a special all things Congo, all things Rwanda, all things Africa edition with Yves Engler, Canadian historian, NGO critic, media critic, anti-imperialist thinker and activist, member of Disruption Canada and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and he is the host of his own Canadian Foreign Policy Hour every Monday. Folks, if you subscribe to Yves Engler, that's how you'll get all of Yves' latest articles, and that's when you'll get an invite to check out the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and you can ask questions to Yves after he's done giving the news wrap-up. And author, of course, of 12 or 13 books, latest Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, which he co-wrote Owen Schlock, and get all of his books, especially Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation. And before I leave you, Yves, thank you so much for joining me on this Sunday on Congo's Independence Day Here's hoping we all live to see the day where Congo and all of Africa and Haiti and similar nations and regions will be truly independent, power to the people, and death to Western imperialism and colonialism in all of its forms. So, ciao till then, Eve.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks.